going to get started. Welcome this morning. My name is Ann Ayers. I am the Dean of the Colorado Women's College here at the University of Denver, and also have the honor in serving as one of the co-leads of the Community Plus Values project that we are bringing to the full DU community. And just a quick word about the Community Plus Values project. It's really founded on a belief that having a sense of belonging in this community is one of the most important and powerful experiences that we can offer to folks who are here, to faculty, staff, students, alums, and partners and friends of the university as well. We really want to open our arms and make sure that you know that you have a home here, and ask you how you want that home to be. And that's part of the values exploration that we're going to be doing. So we're delighted to be able to bring these weekly webinars to you and to talk about things that are of consequence and that matter to us as individuals and to us as a community. And today's topic is near and dear to my heart. I think in my own teams, I've started to feel sort of a little bit of a lull, and you know, as people kind of are settling in to the realities around us, and being a bit deluged with some of the really hard news, staying connected and grounded is so important. So I could not be more excited, actually, to have Art Jones, who's here with us today. I want to read you a little bit about his bio. So Dr. Jones is a licensed clinical psychologist, an interdisciplinary teacher, scholar, and singer. Art has spent the majority of his career in higher education, including nearly 3 decades. We've been blessed to have Art for here at the University of Denver. I had the opportunity to attend a celebration of Art last year. It was a remarkable thing because people spoke in incredible terms. People also sang some of the toasts that they did, which makes sense because Art has a real background in music, and I want to tell you a little bit about that. He's really very much of a student teacher. Art was telling me recently that he is completing his final year of deep immersion in an adult contemplative spirituality institute known as the Living School at the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque. And so here is someone who has a PhD degree in clinical psychology from the University of Iowa in Iowa City, has taught in music and in psychology here at the University of Denver, and yet is taking this time to be a student. So really just someone who learns and teaches and continues to bless us with the richness of both. Art is also described often as a singer-scholar, so has spent a lot of time singing in different capacities, comes from a family in the Bronx, New York, with a background in singing. I think your father was a singer, Art, is that right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and so I think I remember you telling me that you were started down this path of the arts and singing, but you also had a financial reality, which is a little bit of what took you to psychology.
Absolutely. I was a first-generation college student, and the idea of a career in music just didn't seem realistic. So.
Right, but you've managed to do both, and so you've sung with the Colorado Opera, with the Colorado Springs Symphony, and then really importantly brought the Spirituals Project to the University of Denver, which has been really remarkable. And so I know that you'll chat with us about what that has meant for you and in your life. And I also want to just say that you're really bad at one thing, which is retiring. It just seems like you're just, Art, you know, being a servant leader, retired last year. That was the celebration I got to be a part of, and is a professor emeritus in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, also recognized as a professor emeritus for the Colorado Women's College, where you touched so many lives, but then came back because you have this sense of service to the University of Denver. We're so grateful for as the Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion for this last year, and have played a really important role. So I am really, really grateful for that. And I want to tell you that you're part of the reason I fell in love with DU, because hearing your story and the way that you have not only been free to explore, but supported in that exploration just makes me happy and proud to be here. So I want to welcome you. I also want to welcome Dill, who has been so much fun to work with. Dill Khan is a first-year graduate student at the Media, Film, and Journalism Studies School. She's earning her master's in Media and Public Communication, and is a graduate fellow, one of our 3 graduate fellows on the Community Plus Values Experience Pathway. really looking at how we use storytelling and validation of people's stories to understand our values and to create community, and is an absolute pleasure to work with. So I'm just gonna pop off here and let you have this great conversation. And then I'll dive back in at about 11:40 and give voice to some of the questions that we invite you to put through the chat window and through the Q&A. So
all right.
yeah. Let's get going.
Yeah. All right, thanks so much, Anne. Thanks for that nice introduction as well. So what I'd like to do before we get started is I'd like to play a clip. The video that you're going to sort of see and hear is the full-length video is about 8.5 minutes, and we're going to put the link to that so that you're able to watch the whole thing on your own. And I want to encourage you all to do that afterwards because I think it's worth watching the whole thing, but I didn't want to spend 8.5 minutes in this forum for it. But this is basically from a choral ensemble known as the Aeolians, and they're from Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama. And you'll get to hear them sing this special rendition of We Shall Overcome, which is from the Civil Rights Movement. But let's start out with that, and then we'll talk a little bit about it afterwards.
Hello, everyone. Crazy times, huh? On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. And it seems as if the world has come to a screeching halt. And in times like these, it's natural for everyone to be anxious and scared and not really sure of the future. There's a song that got us through one period in time. And I believe that same song can get us through this period. So from my family, the Aeolians, and myself, we just simply want to say, hold on, let's keep each other in prayer. And at the end of this, we can say we use this time to reset, to relax, and to recalibrate and become more connected with the community. Such a beautiful thing. I've seen more of my neighbors in these last few weeks than I've ever seen. So hold on, and we'll get through this together.
We shall overcome. We shall
Dr. Jones, before we sort of begin our conversation about spirituality in a virtual world, I just wanted to ask you, can you share with us why you wanted to play that sound clip?
Yeah, no, thanks, Dill. One of the things that is really important about spirituality when it's working at its best is that it gets us out of our narrow sense of ourselves, this kind of puny kind of sense of ourselves as individual beings that are separated from everyone else. It's kind of a narcissistic kind of thing. And it gets us into a sense of being part of something much larger. It's almost a mysterious kind of experience that we're connected to not only each other, but to nature, to the world, to the universe, to something that's really large and expansive, and that is filled with lots of love. And this, a lot of people call this contemplation. That's kind of how you get to that kind of thing. And there's a lot of confusion often between the word, what contemplation is. People tend to think of that, about it as a practice. So, you know, the contemplative traditions that involve sitting in quiet and meditating. But actually contemplation, if you really think about it, really more is the end point. It's what you're trying to get to. And one of the most amazing forms of contemplation, even though it's not recognized, is what some scholars, and one of my favorite is Barbara Holmes. I invite anybody to look at any of the things that she's written. She calls it crisis contemplation. And it's like when you're in a crisis, what is it that's going to help you get out of your sense of self and the individual thing that you're experiencing and feel this deep sense of connection? And in the African American tradition, that is done often through communal singing. And it's the communal singing that gets you to that. And I thought this clip from the Aeolians, this is a Seventh-day Adventist, historically Black college in Huntsville, Alabama. I thought it was a really great illustration of a group of students who are experiencing this COVID crisis and using that singing to get them out of that sort of narrow sense of who they are. So I think it's just a really good, yeah.
Well, it was a beautiful video, and I can't wait to watch the rest.
Yeah, if you watch the whole
how
thing,
are you
when we watch the whole
experiencing
thing,
and
yeah. Excuse me, I'm sorry, Dale, go ahead.
No, it's all right. How are you personally experiencing and expressing your spirituality? And is it any different to the way that you expressed or experienced your spirituality before the pandemic, or is it similar?
Yeah, I think it's different. I think just like everybody else, when, you know, things are quote unquote normal, I often lose track of what's really important. You know, because I'm going around and doing all these things and I have meetings on my calendar and I've got to get in my car and drive across town to do this or go to the store, pick up things or whatever. And I think I get lulled into thinking that all these things that I'm doing every day are really essential parts of life. And I think during this crisis, when we've been forced to shelter at home, I've really become much more aware of how important it is to really get to that deeper sense of what life is all about. And it's forced me really to pay more attention to my spirituality, and in a very good way.
Yeah, I agree. Who or what have you leaned on during this pandemic?
Well, you know, as Anne mentioned, one of the exciting things for me right now is that I'm involved in this institute called the Living School, and that's in Albuquerque, and it's an organized program. And so I'm doing a lot of reading of some sacred text and some books and things like that, but also just really being very disciplined about daily spiritual practice. So my meditation practice, I do a form of practice that's called centering prayer. And, you know, I'm making sure that I do that at least twice a day, 20 minutes each, and it really does really help me. And I also feel really fortunate to be in a wonderful marriage, and my wife and I are both sheltering in place alone, and just, you know, reinforcing and just being affirming the care that we have for each other has just been particularly important.
Yeah. Um, you sort of mentioned that you practice, you said centered meditation,
Centering prayer, it's called. Yeah,
centering prayer, right?
yeah, yes.
Um, so how can we practice spirituality during a crisis? How do you find
Well,
time?
well, I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that there are things that we need to get to that get us beyond all the worries that we have in the middle of the crisis, but also that connect us to um, it connects us in a paradoxical way to all the suffering as well. It's really, for me, it's really important that we don't think about
Mm,
spirituality as an escape, but it's actually a connection. And so I find, even during this time that I'm sheltering at home and I have all these responsibilities and things on my calendar, that if I put my spiritual practice times
mm,
on my calendar, so that it's very clear to me when I
mm.
open up my electronic calendar that that Zoom meeting that I have at 1 o'clock or that other thing, this practice is also important because it's on there too. And I think people have different ways of prioritizing things for themselves, but that's the way I do it. And I find that really helpful. So it's not an
Mm.
add-on, it's right an integral part of my day.
Right. I love that. Um, I sort of do the same. I'm almost Asian, and so I've also been making it a priority to put it on my calendar because if I don't, then I'm not going to
Yeah.
make it a priority and I won't do it. Meditation is so important. Yeah. Um, for those that were exploring spirituality, how do you continue that work or strive to live a more spiritual life in this time?
Well, I think it's a trite phrase, crisis is opportunity, but it really is true. I think the reasons why we have these things that we call trite is because they happen so often, and there's a real kernel of wisdom that's in the middle of these phrases. And for me, it's just been really interesting that even though there's something that's really uncomfortable about not being able to do our regular things or whatever, there's so many things that kind of come up. So for example, I belong to a church community in Denver, and I'm part of a social justice ministry where we're really attempting to kind of look at um, systems of injustice and everything. Right now, we've been focusing on some of the unique challenges that come up in the jails, in the prisons during this time, and it's brought our group
Mm,
closer. Even though we're isolated, we've been finding ourselves kind of getting together on Zoom and planning. We're involved in a community organizing effort, and we did what it's called a research action, talking to the chief public defender and figuring out some strategies, ways that we can help as a group. And it's like very invigorating to think about that. And it's just, I find it
mhm.
just amazing that out of this kind of crazy period, these other things can come up and get elevated. And you just have to realize that these are opportunities that are out there for us.
Yeah. I mentioned the church group that you are a part of and their spirituality and physical spaces or houses of worship. But how do we maintain that sense of connection with your spiritual community?
Yeah, I think one of the things for me, and I don't know how it is for other people, because I think that many people have a particular routine, and the physical space that they're in is really important. I tend to, I have really more and more as I've
Hmm.
gotten older, separated out the specific physical space from the larger experience of spirituality and community. So for me, It's just being able to touch base with some of those folks in that community. So just in an intentional way. And it's so funny, we all talk about getting zoomed out, and I definitely feel like I get zoomed out with all the meetings, the professional meetings that I have. But I don't feel that when I'm on Zoom with my friends and people that I really care about. It's almost the opposite. I'm sort of COVID. So I've been having regular connections with groups of folks from my church, and that's been helpful. I don't find watching a church service online to be that helpful to me, but I think that's different I know there are people in my community that are very conscientious about going online and watching these virtual church services. And I think if that's a way to do it, I think it's important. I think people have individual ways of doing it. I also want to mention that we can kind of get caught up in thinking about, in a kind of an elite way, about what spiritual practice is. But there's so many different kinds of everyday things that bring us into this contemplative experience that we don't even recognize. So, you know, for some people it's cooking, you know, or gardening, or, you know, just spending time playing with children, that there's something that happens in that experience that takes you out of that narrow kind of self-focus into this larger, expansive spiritual place. You know, I think, you know, as a psychologist, I think about the fact that it's a pretty traumatic thing to be born into the world, you know, and what we call personality is really the adaptive patterns that we all develop to deal with the trauma of being in this crazy world where there's all this sound and chaos and conflict and whatever. And that personality confines us. And what spirituality is about, it's sort of being able to figure out a way to transcend those narrow adaptive patterns. And it's the places, and it's the people, and it's the rituals, and it's the things that we do to connect to ourselves in that way.
I think I'm wondering about Dill's connection, so I might just jump in.
Yeah.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you to think about, kind of building on our conversations from last week with DU Dialogues, is you know, talking about spirituality, and you and I and some others talked about this in preparation for this conversation. Spirituality can be a place where we can be really divided sometimes, because people come from different backgrounds and different perspectives, and the virtual world is a place where we can be divided. And so I was wondering if you have any just thoughts or even a story about how do you cross that divide when you don't share the same spiritual beliefs with someone, and you need to talk about it, because I think that's part of what we do at DU is have these hard conversations.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important issue. And I think that, you know, as I mentioned, sort of my sense of what spirituality is all about is that it actually ultimately, when it's at its best, it connects us to other people, and it actually connects us rather than divides us. But there is a reality that people have different ways of entering into that, and different kind of beliefs about what's important and what's not important. And those can be sources of tension. But I actually believe that when you are operating in a genuine way, those differences actually can be enriching rather than divisive. I had this wonderful experience years ago, back in the 90s, with my friend and mentor, Vincent Harding, of being involved in a group that was called Spirit and Struggle. And basically it was kind of a gathering of African-American community leaders from around the country who were all coming out of different spiritual traditions. So we had Muslims, and we had people who were Buddhist in their orientation, and we had Catholics and Protestants. And we would start out each day with having a worship service out of a particular tradition. And then we would have a discussion. Everybody would join in a discussion about that faith tradition. And you could see that some people would get kind of uncomfortable about it, but over time, what would happen is that people really felt affirmed in each of our own kind of faith traditions, but at the same time we felt connected. So it's like a both end. But this like really takes work to do this, because I think the reality is we all know that religion has been used as a force to divide people, and in almost every tradition it's done that. But that's for me, that's just a function of our kind of narrow psychological selves. When we actually are deeply spiritual selves, I think we get enriched by that diversity. And I also happen to believe that you can't get to that larger, expansive place without being very specific about who you are. So for me, as you know, an African-American man who grew up in New York in a Christian tradition, I can't think of spirituality in an abstract way. I have to think about it in the way that I grew up. But it's sort of like in order to really affirm that universal kind of quality, you need to be very specific about who you are. And you also have to be very curious about people who are coming from different places so that you can connect. And I know that sounds like a paradox, but I think when it's working at its best, it really is true. You know, one of my favorite spiritual teachers, not in person, but just through his writings, was Thomas Merton, who is this Trappist monk who at the end of his life, the last stages of his life, said he felt more connected to monks of other traditions than he did to Catholics, because he knew that they all had their own individual things, but they all knew that they were going to get to the same kind of place of connection and still stay rooted in their own traditions. So I thought that was really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Dylan, I'm going to let you continue. I just wanted to jump in because I couldn't tell if we were breaking up.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So sorry. Yeah, Zoom has not been my friend today.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, in a time of crisis, we seem to prioritize these feelings of panic, fear, and sadness. How can we stop giving into these impulses? And I just want to note that it's important for ourselves to feel these emotions, but we shouldn't let it overwhelm us.
Yeah, I think it's tricky, right, Dill? Because
Yeah.
it's so natural for us to to wallow in them, not just give in to them, right? It's real easy to wallow in these emotions. I think the most important thing is to recognize that this is part of life. Our goal is not to be these perfect people, because we're not. None of us are perfect, and we're going to feel that stuff. And I think it's more like to be able to say, okay, here it is again, and to know it's there, but to not feel like that's what defines us, you know, and to know that we can always, you know, if we are patient, find our way back to a deeper sense of who we are. But those are real, and also some of the stuff that's happening is real. I just found out yesterday that one of my old friends, who I haven't seen in a long time, died yesterday. He was in the hospital and he died, and I hadn't seen him in years, but I just found myself just kind of flooded with lots of, you know, horrible feelings, and also being angry and not, you know, and I mean, the mourning and the grieving is natural, but I found myself being angry at the administration in Washington and all our political divisions and all this other stuff. And I had to just sort of stop and say, okay, there it is. But, you know, ultimately that's not going to be that helpful.
I'm sorry for your loss.
Yeah.
And it sort of brings me to my next question, right? With this pandemic is bringing up issues of fear and uncertainty. How do we stay grounded in our spirituality and not lose our faith? with so much loss and panic around us.
Mhm. Well, we have to turn to the things that um, we know. Everybody has things in their life that they know are sources of comfort and whatever, and it's different for different people. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
for me, music is really important. And
Yeah.
you know, in addition to my spiritual practice, you know, I'm pretty frugal in terms of, you know, money. I don't spend money on expensive things or whatever. But one thing I have invested in is I have Sonos speakers in every room of my house. And when things are really bad, I pick some favorite music from Spotify or Pandora or whatever, and I play it
Yeah.
through the whole house. My whole house is filled with music. And it's different for me for different things. And I have these different kind of moods, and I know for certain things, you know, at certain times I want to hear grand opera, Italian opera. And there are other times when I just want to hear Smokey Robinson singing, you know. And so, you know, that's my way, but I think all of us have things that are important to us, you know. I know people who want to they clean their house when they're feeling anxious, you know, and that's what grounds them. Or, you know, they get involved in cooking, or they zone out, you know, watching. Obviously we can't watch contemporary sports, but I have to admit there have been times I'm a fan of tennis, even though I've never played tennis myself, but I like watching tennis. So I'm watching these old tennis matches from, you know, 5 years ago, whatever. And those are whatever works, you know, for you. You know, you've got to turn to that. And there's a really fine line between the psychological and the spiritual, you know?
Mm. I would love to listen to one of your Spotify playlists. I feel like you'd have a really good. I feel like you'd have a really good Spotify.
Yeah.
So, do you have any suggestions on ways to prioritize your spiritual well-being? I know that in a time like this, it's so easy to neglect your spirituality.
Yeah, I just think it's a reminder. I think like we talked before about like having that thing on your calendar, the appointment
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, it's an appointment. You know, we know that
Mm-hmm.
if it's on your calendar, you have to do it, right? If I've got a Zoom meeting, you know, with the chancellor, you know, I've got to do that. You know, it's going to be a
Yeah.
problem for me if I don't show up for that. Well, if you
Mm-hmm.
treat this the same way, you say this is
Mm-hmm.
a priority. And I think there is a interesting kind of paradox is that sometimes we feel like we don't have enough time. You know, it's like I don't
Yeah.
have time for that. And
Yeah.
what I find is the opposite is true. It's like when I make time, time's time expands. You know, time is this
Yeah.
interesting thing, this kind of mysterious thing. It's like all of a sudden I feel like I have all this extra time. And that's partly because when we pay attention to our spiritual well-being, we become more focused and more efficient in how we do our work. We are better at it. We're more effective at it. And it's a really kind of strange thing. It's very easy to forget. And I'll admit, there are often times when I forget that when things get really chaotic.
Yeah.
You know, I'm just like, oh, I don't have time for that. And then I have to remind myself, something clicks. I have to remind it, well, wait a minute. This is essential. You know, this is really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. I've learned personally during this pandemic that I always use life as an excuse, and I would always
Right.
used to say, well, I don't have time
Right.
for
Right.
things like that. Like, and it,
Yeah.
you know, through this crisis, I've been being in isolation. I've learned that I do have the time. I'm just not making the time, and those are two
Exactly.
very different things. And so I agree. Making the time, I've noticed that I have more time, um, which is great. We only have a couple minutes left, but I have so many more questions. Just one question. I want to talk more about honoring spirituality and religious holidays. I will
Yeah.
be
Yeah. Yeah.
celebrating a religious holiday in less
Uh-huh.
than a month, and it's
Uh-huh.
obviously going to be my first time spending it not with my community, which kind of sucks, and it's slowly starting to sink in. But how do we celebrate religious holidays
Mm-hmm.
virtually?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, boy, I think we have to end up being really creative about that, right? And I think the technology really does help us at this point, to connect to other people. If you know other people for whom those holidays are important, you connect with them. My daughter, who is 31 and lives on the East Coast, all growing up, that these holidays were so important to her. It was such a delight, and when she was a child, seeing that. And so during this time, for me, like for Easter, my first thing was to get on Zoom with her because I knew that she valued Easter as much as I did, actually even more. And so, get on and have a calendar in the background and think about telling stories about, oh, do you remember back in, 1995 when we had Easter and so came and whatever, and just sort of figuring out this sort of creative way to create a story, a narrative that we could share with each other that could help us to recreate the feelings that we've had when we've celebrated those holidays in the past. And it's sort of interesting. In some ways, it felt even more meaningful. It felt better. It's like a better Easter than the ones that I've had in the past. So I think, we just have to like grab outside the box and find things that are good, that work for us.
Yeah, I think we've had to find unique ways during this pandemic to build community and stay in touch with them. Speaking of community, and I know that you had mentioned your friend that you had lost yesterday. So many of us have lost so many people in our lives. How do we deal with loss during this time, and how do we support those who have lost someone?
Well, that's a really important question. And I think for one thing, is that we've got to accept that grieving is natural and it's human, and that we're going to suffer. We're going to feel bad. And I think trying to push it away is not helpful. We live in a culture that expects us to, just take a, really short period and then get back to things as they are. And I actually admire some of my friends from other traditions, like for Jews that I know who sit Shiva, who, take time out to say, this is going to be a time that I have to feel what I'm feeling, to grieve this. And for other people, I think it's really important to just be there for them and to be a container or a source of support. The worst thing is to say, I know how you feel, because you don't. And it's just to be available and not to like go out of your way to do things that they don't want you to do, and just to be tuned into how you can support them in ways that they want, and be available to them.
Yeah. I don't know if I have any more time for questions. I think Anne is probably going to take over, but thank you so much, Art.
Well, thank you, Dill. Thank you so much. It's a great conversation.
Yeah, wonderful conversation.
It is. I'm going to ask my very first question of Dill. How about this? I'll just turn the table on you. As you asked Art for his advice on thinking about the holiday. You're coming up on celebrating, and you had shared with me that as you go through Ramadan, that breaking fast is usually something that you do with community, and you haven't been able to do that. What have you found in the last few days that you have been able to do? I know you're kind of on a journey searching for some of it, but do you mind sharing a little bit?
Of course, yeah. It's been really interesting. I've the first couple of days of Ramadan, I've had some friends come over and give like share a plate of food or a bag of food, or just offer something, right? Like something that they had intended for me, right? So like, for example, when since we can't gather together and break our fast, they have a set you know, set aside food for me that was intended, right, for me to eat. And so to have just people drop things off has been amazing. I've also been doing the same thing. I've been going over to friends' houses, those who are celebrating Ramadan, and just dropping off like a plate of brownies or like a plate of food. And we obviously we're physical distancing, so you know, we chat and we talk, you know, from a safe distance. But I've noticed that we're building a community that way, right? Like it's offering something. It's just being there. It's obviously difficult because I do want to break my fast on Zoom or FaceTime with friends. But some of my friends are on different like time zones, so we can't break fast at the same time. So we're sort of figuring out how we would maneuver around that. But yeah, I'm just noticed even like this past week, just offering food and offering support. It's been amazing.
Yeah, I love that. I might bring you some food too. Even though we come from different backgrounds, I would love to do that. And I've really appreciated you kind of reaching out and sharing a little bit of your experience. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, Dill, and I think can I just sort of chime in there? I think, Dill, I think we sometimes forget how much food is, you know, how important food is in terms of connection and community and hospitality. I participated in a whole weekend workshop about the role of hospitality during the civil rights movement. You know, people talk about the movie, you know, it's sort of like going to somebody's house and eating fried chicken, you know, before you're getting ready to go to the march and that kind of stuff. Food is so incredibly important.
All right, Art, we have some really big questions for you. Really, truly, will you run us through a few, like your, I don't know, 10 things that are on your Spotify list? What are you listening to? What is the Dr. Jones list? DJ Art.
Wow. Well, you know, one thing I will have to start out with is saying I feel really old because I've never actually totally connected to the hip hop traditions. So I know that there are a lot of people who really be disappointed in that. I've kind of had to force myself when I've taught classes on African American music. When we get to the hip hop part of the class, I let the students take over because I don't, you know, I haven't, you know, so I feel really old in that way. So I'm sort of frozen, you know, like 1980 and before, you know, before that. But I love listening when I'm feeling like you know, a set of calm. I love listening to classical music and, you know, especially, you know, things that they're called adagios. There's this like slow kind of contemplative kinds of things. So I have a bunch of those kinds of things that I listen to. I also love the R&B traditions and the doo-wop traditions of the 60s, 50s and 60s. Little Anthony and the Imperials and Smokey Robinson, folks like that. Those are my favorite kind of go-to things. I also love the crooners, you know, Nat King Cole, Johnny Mathis, those folks are really there. And I love grand opera. I love Italian opera. I love listening to Pavarotti and to Leontine Price and Kathleen Battle. The Spirituals Project had the great fortune of actually doing a program with Kathleen Battle last year downtown. And that was, you know, she actually was kind of a piece of work to deal with as a person. So I had to remember how much I love her music after we had to deal with her personally. But I love that kind of stuff. So those are there too. And then jazz, a certain kind, you know, especially sort of some of the piano jazz and cool jazz stuff is really important. And so I'm pretty eclectic. And obviously the spirituals. I have a great collection of spirituals, recordings that are folk spirituals, concertized spirituals, ensembles, soloists, all those kinds of things. But I spend so much time singing that music in the Spirituals Project that I often don't actually take the time to listen to it other times because I get my fill from actually singing.
I know we have at least one or maybe more folks who are part of that group with you who are on this call. So I actually would love Rufina or one of you who's here with us, if you would pop into the chat window. I don't know if you have a link or something to the background of the spirituals, or a way that we can sign up for the mailing list so we can learn about the concerts. I think that would be great for everyone. So Art, one of the questions that has come through is it's really difficult to keep our mental wellness going right now. Lonely and isolated. What practical tips do you have for us until we can be a little bit more in person community?
Yeah, well, you know, one of my things that I have just sort of found over the years is really important is exercise. It's sort of like keeping our bodies kind of fit. And so it's very difficult to do if your normal thing is going out to a gym. You can't go to a gym, but you know, there are all these things that you can find in the New York Times and other places online that are exercises that you can do at home without any equipment. Or whatever. There is something really important about being grounded in our bodies that are like really essential to mental health. And I think that that's really important. The other thing is that our important relationships, you know, we've talked about that a little bit. I mentioned earlier that I think there's a kind of a fine line between the spiritual things that we've been talking about and psychological, because a really healthy psychological sense of experience is also one that is also connected to the deeper kind of level of spirituality. But I think our personal relationships are like really, really, really key. And I loved what I remember an earlier webinar with Shelley Smith Acuna, where she talked about our language and not using the term social distancing.
Yeah.
And think of physical distancing instead of social distancing, and just to remind ourselves that as human beings, that interpersonal contact or relationships are so essential to who we are. My wife and I were watching this program on a Disney Channel the other day about dolphins and how, their need for social connection is so strong, and that that in a lot of ways we're so similar to them, as mammals. That's just such basic thing. Even for, I'm an introvert, but even for introverts, connection to other folks is really important. In fact, Carl Jung, another one of my sort of favorite sort of psychological theorists, talked about introverts in some ways crave connection more. It's that it needs to be intimate and small groups and stuff like that. Extroverts need to have kind of larger kind of gatherings of lots of people, but introverts need connection as much as extroverts do. So.
Right, maybe just a different kind. So this is a question for both of you. Do you have any affirmations? I think things that you tell yourself, or an affirmation that you use that are kind of keeping you going, either one of you, sort of during this time. Dill, let's start with you. Do you have any that you think of? 1 second.
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I don't know if this is an official affirmation, but I just tell myself there's sort of a reason for everything. I'm a big believer in destiny, so I think that everything happens for a reason. And so when I face hiccups or obstacles, I tend to get really overwhelmed or sort of question why I'm not in control. But just being able to tell myself, there's a reason why this is happening, right? Like there's a reason for everything. And just even saying that to myself has really helped, right? Like it's helped me move on from some of the obstacles and hiccups that I face in life. And I've also noticed that like when I do say those things to myself, that I just feel better about the situation, knowing that not to get too preachy, but knowing that, you know, God sort of intended these things to happen in my life. And I, you know, ultimately people don't have control over their lives. Like, you know, just because you have, I think this pandemic is a really good example, right? Like you may have set up things that you wanted to do in the next month or in the next couple of weeks, and to just have that taken away, like, right, like just having, you know, I had plans for the end of the month, I had plans every week, and the fact that I've had to cancel all of them really sucks. But at the same time, I just think there's a reason for everything, and just holding on to that.
I love that. Yeah, I try to tell myself I'm quiet. Sometimes I spent 11 weeks on bed rest in a hospital before my twins were born, and that was isolating. And there was just that it's a very similar situation for me. Just in the I feel the same feels. It was, you know, there was a threat of losing those boys, and luckily they're here and happy. But kind of having this overwhelming fear and knowing that my job was to stay by myself and to stay horizontal. So I feel like it's a muscle that I have. It's just like re-exercising that muscle. And I just remember sitting in the hospital and telling myself, just quiet is okay. Quiet's okay. And doing that. Art, what about you? What are some affirmations?
Yeah, I don't have a formal affirmation, but I think I have a kind of a principle that that I've kind of gone to over and over throughout both my personal and professional life, and that is, to thine own self be true. And that sounds trite, because there's so much pressure to conform to certain ways of doing, you know, doing a job. Even, you know, it certainly has been true for my career, you know, as a faculty member in higher education. You know, there's certain things that a psychologist is supposed to do, or certain things that, you know, you're supposed, even in this role as the Interim Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, there's a certain way to do this job. And I've had to have to remind myself, no, I've got to be who I am. And when I remind myself of that, it also helps me to try to get out of that narrow sense of the narrow sense of identity, more the bigger, expansive. What are my strengths? How am I at my best when I'm in the world?
Yeah. I'm wondering about, you know, Art, you've given us permission. I've heard a theme of this a little bit throughout, and sometimes when I go to conferences, and often they're women's conferences because of the work that I do, we'll have a speaker who will stand up and say, I give you permission to take care of yourself. And a little bit of that, sort of the permission of knowing and owning who we are, as a way to stay centered as we engage in conversations with other people. Also the permission to take breaks and to stop, and to exercise, the permission maybe to break some rules, as we think about spirituality and faith traditions and how we adapt, how we celebrate loss, how we also celebrate holidays. So I just want to say thank you for that, because I think that giving those permissions and reminding us to do that is really powerful. So I sent something in the chat window too. I don't know if you saw it, but I have a crazy idea I want to see if we could maybe do. We've had a lot of great responses about the clip that you shared with us at the beginning of this. And I was kind of wondering, Art, if maybe our gift, your gift to us, but our gift to everybody on this would be to take these last 5 minutes and have you maybe offer a meditation prompt or something that you could think for us that you would wish for everybody. And then maybe we could ask Tremaine to just play that clip. And that could be the rest of how we close, and folks could listen to the clip, and we'll go ahead and play it past the top of the hour because I think it's 7 or 8 minutes long. But that might be a nice send off. Does that, I'm ad-libbing right in the middle of everything. Is that all right?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're talking about continuing the clip from the Aeolians?
Yeah, and I think we started from the beginning, and clip from the Aeolians, but maybe we offer this as some you meditate around your house with music. You said that's something you use. So we'll just take the Art Jones model and send everybody off with a little music. But do you have something that you would encourage us to think about? You said to thine own self be true. Something we might meditate on as we listen to the music.
Yes, I think, and this too shall pass, and this too shall pass, reminding ourselves that it shall pass and what comes up will not be what we've had before. And we don't know what that is, but to feel like we're open to what new things are going to be emerging.
Yeah, I love that. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. This has been, yeah.
You're just really a treasure for our community. So thank you for taking the time. And Dill, I'm so glad you joined DU also. It's only been about 6 months for you, but a big future ahead. And I hope maybe if we're lucky, you'll be here for 30 years too. Who knows? Doing reporting, running our communications department, I don't know, something great. So, all right, I'm going to ask Tremaine to go ahead and play this clip. We invite you to join us online for C+V, but thank you so much and have a really wonderful rest of your day and enjoy this meditative time.
Hello, everyone. Crazy times, huh? On March 11th, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. And it seems as if the world has come to a screeching halt. And in times like these, it's natural for everyone to be anxious and scared and not really sure of the future. There's a song that got us through one period in time. And I believe that same song can get us through this period. So from my family, the aliens, and myself, we just simply want to say, hold on, let's keep each other in prayer. And at the end of this, we can say we use this time to reset, to relax, and to recalibrate and become more connected with the community. Such a beautiful thing. I've seen more of my neighbors in these last few weeks than I've ever seen. So hold on, and we'll get through this together.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome.